Well, all right. Mystery Babylon. So for next week, we are finally here, the second coming. The second coming of Christ. Not the rapture of the church, but the second coming of Christ. And we're going to look at a little known theology study. It's called the Bosra Deliverance. And we're going to actually dig into the second coming. A lot of ideas around there is that Jesus just all of a sudden comes to Jerusalem and then that's what happens. It actually is more complicated than that. And I think it helps bring in maybe a little bit of Daniel's time period. When we look at Daniel chapter 12, when we see we have three different time periods. We have 1,260 days, we have 1,290 days, and then we have 1,335 days. What are all these different times? And I think the second coming of Christ is a one-day thing, but yet at the same time, I think that day may start at different periods. And I'll explain better next week. But as we look, we see Jesus is coming to the Bosra, which we'll explain where that is next week. We see that he is at the Battle of Armageddon, which is, basically southeast, east, and northeast, and north of Jerusalem, and that whole valley of Jezreel. But we also see him at the temple, and that's Micah chapter 3. So we're gonna look at that. But before we get there, we're gonna look at Mystery Babylon. So in Revelation 17 and 18, we have the Great Whore, which is basically all false religion. And then Revelation 18 is Babylon the Great, which is a city or nation. So we have the religious system judged in Revelation 17. And then we actually have the seat of that religious system at that time judged in Revelation 18. So let's take a look here. First of all, Babylon. Revelation 17 is the great harlot, and it represents. Here we go. 2 Thessalonians. This is it's important to remember. We've talked about this in the past, but we see that the coming of the Antichrist is preceded by a strong delusion, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. So that they may believe what is false. So we remember now that the Antichrist, he sets himself up against all gods. Not just Jesus, not just Jehovah God. He sets himself above every so-called God. Whether it's Jesus, whether it's some Confucius Buddhist system, or whether it's a tree. Remember, we've got people still today in the winter solstice and the summer solstice around Stonehenge that are worshiping rocks and trees and shrubs and everything else. The Antichrist, what is Satan's main beef with God? Satan was like, hey, I'm pretty too. Why should you get all the glory? I deserve some glory. And that jealousy created this enmity between Satan and man, because Adam was given the keys to the garden. And that really was a slight to Satan. Because Satan had already been cast out at that time. And God gives the keys to the garden, the upkeep of the garden, this perfect garden, to this mortal, well, at the time immortal, but flesh, human being, man, and his wife. And that really upset Satan. So, Satan's goal now is to take all worship. That's what he's been striving for. We see that in Luke 4, Matthew 4. When all he wants, he's willing to give up the entire world, which is his to give right now. Because remember, Satan does not have the title deed of the earth taken from him until Revelation 4. That's what those seals that we're seeing, in Revelation 5. That's where Jesus is redeeming the title deed to the earth. So, but up until this point, his goal is to get everybody to worship you, and that was what he wanted to do with Jesus. And that third temptation, remember, he took him up to the highest point of the earth, and he said, all of this I'll give you And see, Jesus didn't say it wasn't yours to give. Because see, it was his to give. Mm-hmm. And all Satan wanted from Jesus was what?
Not to say God is.
Well, go ahead, Herman. What did all Satan wanted from Jesus was what?
Worship.
Worship. He said, I will give you all of this if you will just fall down and worship me. That's all. So, God is going to send man on this earth a strong delusion. What is the key when we talk about man or woman coming to Christ? What is the very first step that happens there? John 6:44. No man can come to the Father unless he draws him. Right. So, this strong delusion here, remember, it's, this is where we get into Calvinism and Arminianism and can you lose your salvation? Is it predestination? Some very deep things with some great people on either side of it. It's really not worth the fight. But we have to remember that God is the ultimate keeper of the heavenly gate. And no one's getting in that he doesn't want in. That's just the way it is. He's God. Okay? And so he, rather than draws these people, he will send them a strong delusion so that they will embrace a lie rather than to believe the truth. So,
Is that supposed to be on?
it is on. It fades off. I got the red blinking light, so we're good.
One of the scenarios out here about that too is the demonic UFO thing. That
And
they're going to say that we created you and that there is no God.
And we're going to talk about that in the scenarios the last couple of weeks. When we get into the scenarios of how do we wrap all of this book of Revelation up into a picture that it might actually look like. I mean, we looked at a lot of pieces, right? How do we, if we were to create a timeline, now will that timeline be right? Probably not. Some pieces of it I think will be right. But one of those pieces is, what does this delusion look like? And I honestly believe the UFO phenomenon has something to do with that. And there are reasons behind that. It's, if you study enough prophecy, like real world, this is going on right now prophecy, you see some things that don't appear on the news. And you realize that it's demonic deception is what's happening.
Exactly.
So, let's get to the source. Let's get to the root of it. Where is Babylon? Where did it originate? And we have to go all the way back to the book of Genesis. Okay? Cush fathered Nimrod, and he was first on the earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, in the land of Shinar. All right? And what's interesting is, that's a little bit of a mistranslation in our Bibles, because what it really means is he was a hunter in defiance of the Lord. That word before can mean I'm in front of you in one of two ways. I'm doing this in front of you, or I'm doing this trying to put myself in front of you. Y'all see what I'm trying to say here? So in this instance, the word before in the Hebrew really means he is a hunter defying the Lord. Hey, I'm doing this before you. Whatever he was doing, I'm doing it before you, and you can't do anything about it. So there we get that first, and really what this is, and you will see, if you study enough prophecy, you will see that Nimrod is an Antichrist prototype. Mm-hmm. Many times you will hear prophecy teachers, and I don't want to put them, Dwight Pentecost I think is one, but I don't want to put words in his mouth. A great prophecy teacher of days gone by, he basically calls the Antichrist the second Nimrod. And some of these older prophecy teachers do, because he is a reinventing of Nimrod. And Nimrod literally means we will rebel. That's what the word means. And Babylon, as we see in Isaiah 47:5, is called the mistress of the kingdoms. Now, what's a mistress? She's a harlot. She's someone cheating with a married man. All right, and we need to remember that what we talked about last week, that God views spiritual adultery, idol worship. Anytime you're putting something before God, that's spiritual adultery.
Right.
Because He equates being with you as a man leaving his house and marrying a woman. Okay, it's a spiritual union. And anytime you interject something in between that spiritual union, you are committing spiritual adultery.
That's right.
And many of the Old Testament prophets, I mean, you see it in Ezekiel, you see it in Hosea, you see it in many of these minor prophets where you talk about the spiritual adultery. And you see it in Isaiah here, and that's where it's called Babylon's the mistress of the kingdoms.
I've also heard it called spiritual fornication.
Spiritual fornication, yeah, it's anything that defiles the marriage bed. The wicked woman from the land of Shinar, Zechariah 5, 6 through 11. This is a very interesting vision. One that's always just absolutely puzzled me. I've read it, I don't know how many times, and it just, I don't know. I think everybody's probably got something in the Bible that you read and you just like, it just speaks to you in a different way, and it probably doesn't speak that way to anybody else, but it speaks to you in a very different way. Can I see your Bible? Because I'm going to read this. But Zechariah 5, and then there's all sorts of little visions in here, but this is the vision of the woman in the basket. And actually, I'll start in verse 5. It says, "The angel who talked with me came forward and he said to me, 'Lift up your eyes and see what is that is going out.' And I said, 'What is it?' And he said, 'This is the basket that is going out.' And he said, 'This is their iniquity in all the land.' And behold, the leaden cover was lifted, and there was a woman sitting in the basket. And he said, 'This is wickedness.' And he thrust her back into the basket, and thrust down the leaden weight on its opening. Then I lifted up my eyes, and behold, 2 women were coming forward. The wind was in their wings, and they had wings like the wings of a stork. And they lifted up the basket between the earth and the heaven. Then I said to the angel who talked with me, 'Where are they taking the basket?' And he said to me, 'To the land of Shinar, to build a house for it. And when this is prepared, they will set the basket down there at its base.'" That's a lot going on. And it's just, that is one of those passages, that is one of those passages is always like, wow, I want to know exactly what that is. What are the stork? What are the 2 women? You know, and there's a lot of ideas out there, and it's just one of those.
Women are angels, right?
Maybe.
That's what
Maybe.
Wings.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. But we know that from Genesis 10 that it was in the land of Shinar. Babylon was in the land of Shinar. And so Zechariah 5 is referring specifically to Babylon. So this is the takeaway from this. All forms of idolatry originate in Babylon. Every false religion that's ever existed originates in the land of Shinar, where that woman in the basket is set down in its place. That is wickedness. That's the source of all wickedness. If you go to the Mormon church today, you go to the Jehovah's Witnesses, you go to India, to a Hindu temple, you go to a mosque, you go any of these places, you need to remember that it all originates right here. Every form of rebellion against God starts here. Okay? Doesn't mean that there wasn't wickedness before, because we obviously had wickedness in Genesis 6. That's the reason why God sent the flood. But there wasn't idol worship. There was just rebellion.
Right.
This is where idol worship starts. And that's the whole reason for the tower. All right?
Wasn't the tower built on a supposedly Stargate area?
Yeah, like a portal. Like they thought was like a... Right, like Mount Hermon. Yep. So let's look at, we're not going to go through every verse here. We're going to make some assumptions. But I wanted to start it off. It said, "One of the angels who had 7 bowls came to me and said, 'Come, I'm going to show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, and with the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality. Okay, seated on many waters. What does it mean? Seated on waters. Gentiles. Okay? So, anytime you see water, seas, oceans, good job, blah, blah, blah. And it's seven waters, right? Yeah. So, anytime you see waters, that's what we get. This is the Gentile nations. And that's the reason why we say many kings of the earth. That's why John says that, or the angel says that. So, many kings have committed idolatry, remember, which is, like Joe Herman said, spiritual fornication. All right? With her. So, as we look down through verses 3 through 6, we see this. The woman rides a scarlet beast. This is the same beast that is in Revelation 13. The woman is riding it. Now, what's interesting is that the beast is allowing her to ride it. She sits relaxed and comfortable. We notice that from the verses. That she's a key player in this Antichrist system, in the system of the beast. She's arrayed in purple and scarlet. That denotes some kind of a royalty, some kind of an honor that has been given to her. What is purple representative? We know it's royalty, but what is purple also representative of when we look in the Old Testament?
Well,
Debbie's favorite color.
It's my favorite color too. I had a purple car, believe it or not.
Value?
No,
Value?
no.
Okay,
Purple.
wait, so you were saying Old Testament. Say
Well,
the rest of it.
What did the priests, their hymns of their garment, what were they dipped? What color?
Well, I guess
It's purple. It represents a priestly function. Purple is a priesthood. And when we think of purple and royalty with Jesus, we have to remember that Jesus served several functions. He was the priest also. He was our Melchizedek, right? So when he's arrayed in purple, that's the reason why. So she is arrayed in purple and scarlet. All right? Holds a golden cup full of abominations. And she, this is interesting, is drunk with the blood of saints. She is intoxicated from the murdering of actual true Christians. So, when we look at the beast and the dragon in chapter 13, we're going to do a little review. These are just review slides, so I'll go through them pretty quick. 10 horns, and 7 heads and 7 crowns. So we have 10 horns, that's 10 kings, 7 heads and 7 kingdoms. All right? And now we're see where we got that several weeks ago or 2 weeks ago. Revelation 17. It says there's 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is yet to come, or 1 is yet to come, and when he comes, he's going to exist for just a little while. The beast that was, is not, it is an 8 that belongs to the 7. It goes to destruction. All right? So, we looked at this. Remember, 5 fallen. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. Those are the 5 previous kingdoms that had existed over Israel. Those are 5 global type kingdoms that had existed over Israel. Not just, and not including the kingdom of Israel. These are world powers. All right? And one is, at the time of the writing, one is, that's Rome. And then one is yet to come, and that is the Ottoman Turks. Remember, the eastern leg of the Roman Empire lived much longer than the western leg. When we think of, we talked about this too. When we think of the Roman Empire, we think of Italy, Germany, maybe even up to England, that whole expanse. But what we forget is that there was just as much land, if not more, on the east side of it. And that eastern leg of the Roman Empire, what we'd call the African Middle Eastern leg, actually existed far longer than the western leg. So the beast is of the 8, is an 8, but belongs to the 7. And it doesn't belong to the 7th kingdom, it belongs to all of the 7. And so this is the kingdom of Antichrist, and it must originate somewhere where the 7 are, they held common ground. But it can't be Israel, right? Because we see the beast comes from the what?
Water.
He comes from the water, he comes from the sea. So therefore we know he didn't come from the land, so therefore you can't come from Israel. So what we have to do is figure out where did all 7 have a common area. So the 10 have one mind, And they give authority and power to the Antichrist. They make war with Jesus and they kill his followers. So, kingdom of Antichrist. And this is a quick review. We go through, we got Egypt, you got Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, the Roman Empire. See, remember, this is all Rome here, all the way up here. That's a lot. You know, actually it's about the same, maybe a little bit larger than what the Western leg was. So this is all Rome. And I did make one little edit here. And this is the Ottoman Empire. You see the Ottoman Empire pretty much existed where the eastern leg of the Roman Empire was, but it actually expanded some. It went down into Saudi Arabia. Now, the reason why I didn't go in here, because that's just not a fun place to be. I've actually been right there, and it's not no bueno. Javi, that means it's not very good.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Nelson, were the Ottomans the Turks?
Yes, the Ottomans were the Turks. So, when we look at the common area, there we go. So what we know, if we're reading this right in Revelation 17:10, if we're reading this right that it comes from the seven, this is the Antichrist himself, the beast, has to come from some area in this red. Because this is the only place that is common to all 7 places that doesn't include the land of Israel.
Right.
Well, as we talked about, that is one of the things that's interesting because the Zechariah calls him the Assyrian. Okay, we talked about that last week. So, the kings, they receive power and authority for a small time. It calls it an hour, but that's biblical speak for it's not very long. And the harlot is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. Now, this was interesting. The way the Greek is written, that great city, it means as if John is speaking in current terms. This harlot is that great city that has currently dominion over the kings of all the earth. Well, what city was that?
Rome.
It was Rome. In 95 AD, that was the great city that had dominion over everything that they knew as the world. So, as we get down into the latter part of 17, this is interesting. The woman is really hated by the 10 kings and the beast. They hate her. Even though she's riding comfortably on the beast, she's woohoo, drunk with the blood of the saints. She is secretly hated. And they destroy her. They absolutely destroy her. So, what do? They burn her with fire. They devour her. Now, if somebody got verse 17 open, somebody read verse 17 for me.
17:17.
Yes, sir.
For God has put into their hearts to accomplish His purpose by agreeing to give the beast their power to rule until God's words are fulfilled.
Okay. Who put it in their hearts?
God.
God. Okay? So, this is an important lesson. And you read this, if you study the book of Samuel, the 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, what you will see is over and over and over and over and over again, God using the enemies of the people of God to punish the people of God.
Right.
Okay? And you also can see this in some of the Old Testament prophets. God will use whoever He will.
Right.
And if God can use a donkey, remember, He can use you. And there's an interesting thing in Chronicles, I think it's Chronicles, where, is it Josiah, who hears Pharaoh Necho is coming up from Egypt, and God uses Pharaoh, this pagan, to actually speak. It says, hey, and I can't remember if it's Josiah or Jeconiah, I can't remember. But he says, hey, don't go up to this battle. You don't belong there.
Right.
and I believe it was Josiah. What did he do?
It was Josiah.
It was Josiah. And what did he do? He disobeyed what God was saying through Pharaoh, and he went up and got himself killed.
He dressed like a regular soldier.
That's right.
And he got an arrow right in the
Right in the shoulder.
right through the shoulder.
Yep.
Of course, it come out over there.
But God used Pharaoh, who was not a believer in Jehovah, but God spoke to him.
Now, God told him, don't you go down there.
Don't go to that battle. It's none of your business.
And he went on
And
down
he went
there.
anyway.
He paid the price for it.
So remember, God uses who he will to accomplish his judgment. And one of the things that really spoke to me when Pharaoh is using Josiah, when God is using Pharaoh to speak to Josiah, one of the things that taught me a lesson when I first learned that just because this person may not be what I would consider a Christian even, don't always discount what they say. Because God could be using them. If he can use Pharaoh, he can use any old Joe. So always pray. When somebody gives you advice or counsel, always pray. And ask the Lord, is this of you? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be Billy Graham giving you advice. It could be me. It could be anybody. All right? You always got to pray and say, hey, is this of you, Lord? All right? So they have no choice. They're going to enact God's judgment. And God's judgment has been building on this harlot for a very, very, very long time. Okay? So, let's talk about who she is. It's interesting that, remember, in a short span of 5 chapters, we have 2 women. Okay? One is a magnificent woman of Revelation 12, and the other is a whore. So, I don't think that those contrasts are by accident. And what's interesting is both of them are in the wilderness at one point or another. Remember, the first woman goes to the wilderness. And in Revelation 17, we see that the second woman on the scarlet beast, where does he go see her? He goes to the wilderness to see her. She's already there. So, I think that's an interesting contrast. And it speaks to, really, to the first woman, who the first woman is, in her purity. Israel and her purity. And here we have harlotry. Okay? So it also indicates to me that this is a period of time that is devoted for Israel. Remember, we go back to Daniel chapter 9. What is this for? It is for you guys to get your act together and to bring in everlasting righteousness. Which is what they should have done the first time. Alright? So, the great city, that is Rome. Now, what's interesting is Rome has been commonly identified with Babylon for a very long time. Esdras is an apocryphal book, the Sibylline Oracles, and there's others. But Eusebius, in his writings in 303 AD, said that the Apostle Peter always identified Rome as Babylon. That was what he was saying. As a matter of fact, when we see 1 Peter 5:13, we see he writes, she who is in Babylon sends greetings. Well, we know at this period of time, Peter had been in Rome. And so he basically subtly says that whoever it is in Rome sends greetings. Okay? So Peter seems to identify Babylon as Rome and vice versa. Now, she says, I am the queen of heaven. I am no widow. Now, that taken by itself kind of seems kind of flaky. You know, why is saying this? Well, once again, we go to the Old Testament. Isaiah 47, 7 through 9, it says, I shall be mistress forever, or you say, I shall be a mistress forever, who say in your heart, I do not sit as a widow, and I do not know the loss of children. But Isaiah says that 2 things will come to you in a moment. In one day, the loss of children and widowhood shall come upon you in full measure. So even Isaiah here is prophesying at this point in time in Revelation 17 and 18.
Right.
At one day, and we see that in Revelation 17 and 18 that it happens when? At one day, boom, in one time. So, let's talk about who the woman is. The Catholic Church is the most common understanding. Okay? That is the most common evangelical look. And believe it or not, there's actually some Catholics who believe this as well. There's some, what I would consider charismatic Catholics, people who are members of the Catholic Church. And if you ask some Catholics who really study eschatology, matter of fact, my best friend Shane, who was Catholic, he gave me a book called The Keys of This Blood by Father Malachi Martin, which basically said that. And so it was his understanding as a Catholic back in the early 90s that the Catholic Church was going to apostasy, become an apostate church, and led by a false pope.
Right.
That was their understanding. So if you really want to get into this, there's about a 56-minute YouTube video by Dave Hunt called A Woman Rides the Beast. He's also got a book that I've got that I'll lend you guys if somebody wants it. It's called A Woman Rides the Beast. And what it is a close look at church history identifying Revelation 17 and 18 with Rome and the Catholic Church. But I don't want to just leave it there. There are other possibilities. Some believe that it's the United States of America. Believe it or not, there are those who believe that. And some believe it's Saudi Arabia. One of my favorite Bible teachers, Walid Shubat, teaches that it's Saudi Arabia. And believe it or not, the interesting thing is that you can actually see where everybody gets their point of view. If you really sit down and take an open look at it and don't come in from a biased point of view and just listen, you can see why Walid Shubat would say it's Saudi Arabia. You can see why people like Dimitri Duduman said it was the United States of America. And you can see why people like Dave Hunt says the Catholic Church. So, I believe that it's a form of the Catholic Church. And as we get into that, also I want to talk, there are a lot of other interpretations about what the Mystery Babylon could be.
And you got the prophecy of the final pope and
The Pope prophecies, yeah.
pope prophecy.
Which, by the way, according to Saint Malachi, Malachi, we are on the final pope.
Yeah, Peter the Roman.
Yeah, Peter the Roman, which was very interesting. I remember when Benedict became pope, and I remember looking at it and going, okay, we've got one more. And then I remember when Benedict abdicated, and then Francis became pope, and we were at Peter the Roman. And if you really want to get a kick out of something, Google prophecy of the popes, because this was it 11th or 12th century?
Yeah, 12.
And he prophesied 153 popes or something like that.
Yeah.
And what was interesting about the prophecy was he would give these little Latin phrases to describe the pope, and there's a lot of similarities. And they went, pope by pope, and Pope Francis is the last one on the list, and basically he says judgment comes during this pope's. So if Pope Francis dies and we have a new pope, then we know the prophecy of the popes was not correct. So we'll see. But needless to say, I've been watching Francis like a hawk. I really, yeah.
This stuff that he does, man.
Yeah, but stuff that he has done has a lot of Catholics upset. It really does.
Well, he's the first, what do you call it, where he's from, the group? that he's from?
Oh, yeah, he's a Jesuit.
Jesuit.
Yeah. So let me get to this end here. Revelation 18 is just a detailed count of the judgment. She's thrown down in a single hour, just like Isaiah 47 said. All the merchants weep. She's thrown down in violence. And this is the interesting part. God finally gives the judgment that the saints were asking for back in Revelation 5. It's finally here. Because see, we find out that this is what had been killing the saints. Because she was drunk with the blood of saints. The Catholic Church has been killing believers for a very long time.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? But just to be true with the story. Whenever the Protestants were in power, they were doing the same thing. You know, when Bloody Mary got done with her reign of terror in England in the 1500s, and when Elizabeth became the queen, they persecuted Catholics just as bad. So nobody was following Jesus back then. So here's a scenario. So we're going to assume in these scenarios that the Catholic Church is what is spoken of here. All right, this is the assumption of this scenario. Okay, after the rapture of the church, some of you have probably heard about Chrislam. That is the one world religion where they try to join Islam and Christianity. It's going to be pushed by the Antichrist. And what the Antichrist is going to do is going to use the Catholic Church structure to gain power. Since it's already in place in so many countries, you have dioceses and hierarchies, he'll just use it as a vessel. The 10 ruling kings will get in on this action. They're going to use that structure. The 2 witnesses in Revelation are preaching against it. The beast is killed. Okay, the Antichrist is killed. He's resurrected and he walks into the temple declaring himself God. At this point, the beast and the 10 no longer have any use for the Catholic Church structure. And so they kill her. They no longer have any use for anybody competing with the Antichrist. Because remember, what we had done is joined this false system with this kind of what looked to be Christianity, but it wasn't. It was adultery, it was harlotry, to gain power. And then once we've got the power, I don't need you anymore. And by the way, you're a distraction from worship of me, because you're still claiming this thing with God, even though it is false. Okay? Does that make sense? They use her to get what they want. And then once they're done with her, it's over. They destroy her in a day. And I would imagine that the burning with fire is they probably nuke Rome, is what I would imagine. They probably destroy Rome with a nuclear device. They burn her with fire, and it happens in an hour. It happens instantly. And then there's a purge. Okay? There's a purge of the beast and the kingdom of the beast, the Antichrist. He goes through the world purging. And we remember that that's what Isa is supposed to do, the false prophet, is he will tear down all the crosses off all the buildings during this period. That is part of the Islamic prophecy. So they kill the head, they cut the head off of the harlot, and then they'll go through the world, and then it will all be focused on the Antichrist. That makes sense. So, you see, you wonder how are these two systems marrying? Well, there we have Pope John Paul II kissing the Quran. Okay?
That's blasphemy right there.
This is Pope Benedict discussing the Quran and blessing it. And this is Pope Francis discussing the Holy Quran. And Pope Francis was the first one, the current Pope, was the first one to invite Islamic prayers at the Vatican. He did that last year, I think it was last year, where he invited imams, and they held a joint prayer session at St. Peter's Basilica. And he is also the first pope to come out and say that atheists can work their way to heaven. That by them doing good, they are basically acknowledging God even though they don't acknowledge Him.
So he's denying Jesus right there.
Right. So you can kind of get an idea of how this system is going to work. Okay? It's been a slow slide. If you ask some hardcore Catholics, I have some very good Catholic friends, they'll tell you, they love this guy. They liked him. This guy scares the pants off of them. They don't like him at all. Especially when he started inviting imams to pray in the Vatican. That really bothered them. And I've had them tell me privately, I just don't know about this guy. And I'm like, I can tell you about this guy. So, that's where we're headed. That means that the days ahead are going to be harder and harder and harder to stay true to your faith. But
I just heard today on the news how loved he is in Mexico. You know, revered.
and so what do we take from that in light of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2?
What, immediate?
No, 2 Thessalonians 2. God sends them a strong delusion
Yeah.
that they believe the lie. What is the lie? I think part of the lie is that we're all worshiping the same God. That Jesus is not some unique being, that he's just a path. Not the path, not the way, but just a way, a path. That's a lie. And people want to believe that. How many Christians have you talked to who name the name of Christ who want to believe that? Because they can't just, it just sticks in their craw that, well, God would send somebody to hell because they... See, that's a false premise, that you somehow deserve heaven to begin with. So people want to believe the lie. Rather than, believing the truth sometimes is hard. It's unpalatable, we don't like it. But just because we don't like it or don't like the way it tastes, doesn't mean it's not true.
Truth was sacrificed too, though.
Huh? Yeah, truth does come with sacrifice. Yeah, that's a good point. Truth comes with a lot of sacrifice. Sacrifice that maybe just your family thinks you're nuts. Right? So, all right, we got to get rolling. Send us out in prayer.
Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for Nelson and his preparation, Lord, as he leads us through the study. We just pray, Lord, that you give us vision and understanding of your word and how you have us apply it to our life, how we live our life. Will you raise up this world and our nation, Lord, to you? We just pray, Lord, that we will turn our hearts to you, that we'll listen to your word, and our leaders will listen to you and seek your advice, your wisdom and will, and might act on it, even if it means political damage to them. Lord. We just pray for the leader that will stand up for your word among us and lead this nation Christian. We pray, Lord, that you go with us now, that you lift up Brother Chuck as he brings us your message this week. Open our hearts and minds to you. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.